Black caregiver looks after paralyzed woman for years until she hands him a life-changing note. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're diving into an emotional and uplifting journey of love, resilience, and transformation. Join us as we explore the story of Rebecca and James, two individuals who turned life's challenges into a powerful force for healing and hope. Let's begin this heartwarming adventure together. The air was crisp as James stood on the porch, his breath catching slightly in his throat. The house before him was grand, but not in a welcoming way. Its silence felt heavy, almost oppressive. He'd heard about Rebecca, the woman he would be caring for, a once vibrant person now confined to a wheelchair. Life, it seemed, had not been kind to her. She was paralyzed, living alone, and fiercely independent despite her limitations. James knocked gently, his knuckles barely making a sound on the large wooden door. He glanced at the sky, gray with the promise of rain, then back at the door that remained closed for what felt like minutes. Finally, a voice came through, muffled but sharp. "It's open. Come in." James hesitated before pushing the door open, stepping into the dimly lit foyer. The air inside the house was cool, almost as if no one had lived there for quite some time. Shadows clung to the high ceilings, and silence greeted him like an unwelcome guest. His footsteps echoed as he moved further inside, following the voice to the living room. "I'm James," he called softly, "your new caregiver." Rebecca was sitting by the window, a picture of defiance. Her hands rested on the arms of her wheelchair, her expression hard as she glanced up at him with narrowed eyes. The sunlight streaming through the window behind her highlighted the streaks of gray in her once jet-black hair, though her sharp gaze was undimmed by age. "I didn't ask for a caregiver," she said bluntly, her voice cold and without a trace of welcome. James took a slow breath, steadying himself against her unkind reception. He had been in this line of work long enough to recognize the walls people built when life had taken away more than they could bear. "I understand," he replied, his voice warm, without any hint of challenge. "I'm here to make things easier for you. That's all." Rebecca scoffed, her eyes briefly flicking toward the window as if dismissing him. "Nothing about this is easy. Having you here won't change anything." James stood for a moment, considering his next words carefully. He had learned long ago that people like Rebecca didn't need lectures or forced cheerfulness. They needed time, patience, and the quiet strength of someone who wasn't going to walk away. "I'm not here to fix you," he said softly. "I'm here to support you, in whatever way you need." She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her face back toward the window, her lips pressing into a thin line. The conversation already closed in her mind. James could see that there was no use in pushing further today. He had met many people like her, strong-willed, determined to push away anyone who offered help. But behind the walls, he knew, there was always more. James excused himself and moved to the kitchen, trying to establish some routine. Opening the refrigerator, he found it nearly empty, just a few cartons of milk, some leftovers that had long passed their prime, and an apple that had seen better days. He sighed, already planning the shopping list in his mind. With what little he could find, James prepared a simple breakfast: toast, scrambled eggs, and a small vase with a single daisy from the garden outside, a touch of warmth that he hoped would soften Rebecca's mood. Even just a little. He carried the tray carefully into the living room, placing it on the table beside her wheelchair. "I made you some breakfast," he said gently. Rebecca glanced at the tray, then back out the window. "I'm not hungry," she muttered. James placed the tray down without protest. "It'll be here if you change your mind." Each day passed much the same. James arrived early, prepared breakfast, tidied the house, and handled the small tasks that had become too burdensome for Rebecca. She hardly spoke to him at first, her responses clipped and distant. But James remained undeterred. He understood her resistance. It wasn't him she was fighting. It was the unfairness of the life she now found herself in. One afternoon, while dusting the shelves in the living room, James's eyes fell on a forgotten box in the corner. It was filled with old art supplies, brushes, paints, and canvases that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. "Did you used to paint?" he asked, his tone soft but curious. For the first time, Rebecca's eyes softened. "Just a fraction." "I did," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But that doesn't matter anymore. It's never too late," James said gently, his eyes meeting hers. But Rebecca said nothing. She turned away, closing herself off again. James could see the pain beneath her words, the weight of loss that hung around her like a heavy cloak. It wasn't just her ability to walk that had been taken from her. It was a part of her very self. Her passions, her connection to the world outside her window. The garden, now overgrown with weeds, was a perfect reflection of her inner life. Once full of beauty and color, now left to wither. James didn't push, but he didn't stop either. Each day, he brought a little more warmth into the house. Fresh flowers from the market to brighten the kitchen. Soft music playing in the background. A gentle smile as he went about his work. Slowly, without even realizing it, Rebecca began to thaw. She started accepting the meals he made, sometimes even offering a quiet thank you when she thought he wasn't listening. One morning, as James watered the plants on the windowsill, Rebecca broke the silence. "They like the sunlight," she said softly, her voice almost tender. James turned, surprised by the change in her tone. He smiled, walking over to her. "Maybe you could teach me how to care for them." Rebecca hesitated, but after a moment, she nodded. It wasn't much, but for James, it felt like a breakthrough. He knew that trust was being built slowly, brick by brick, and he had no intention of rushing it. Rebecca had been hurt in ways far beyond her physical injury, and he understood that healing wouldn't come all at once. As the days passed, James noticed that Rebecca was beginning to open up in small ways. She would point out the plants that needed more water. And once, when he asked her about the garden outside, she spoke wistfully about how beautiful it had once been, but her face would harden again, as if remembering that the beauty was gone now, just like the life she had once known. For James, this wasn't just a job anymore. Rebecca's pain resonated with him in ways he hadn't expected. He knew what it was like to feel powerless, to face a future that seemed uncertain and full of obstacles. But he also knew that no one had to face those challenges alone. In his quiet moments, James began to think of ways he could help Rebecca beyond just caregiving. He had a feeling that the key to helping her move forward was somewhere in that garden, waiting to be uncovered. As the days continued to unfold, James made sure to maintain his steady routine. Every morning, he'd arrive early, often greeted by the same stiff silence from Rebecca. And every morning, he'd quietly set about preparing her breakfast, tidying the house, and ensuring that she had everything she needed for the day. Yet, beneath the surface of their quiet exchanges, something was slowly changing. Rebecca was starting to allow small pieces of her inner world to peek through the cracks in the wall she had so carefully built around herself. James, ever patient, could sense these changes, though they were subtle. It wasn't in grand gestures or sudden confessions, but in fleeting moments. A gentle sigh when she noticed a flower in the vase he'd placed by her window, or the way she occasionally glanced his way during his daily tasks, as if considering speaking but holding herself back at the last second. He didn't press her, but he made sure to be present, ready to listen if ever she chose to speak. One particularly sunny afternoon, James decided to broach the topic that had lingered in the back of his mind for days: the garden. He had noticed how Rebecca's eyes often drifted toward it, even though she never mentioned it outright. From what he had gathered in their few brief conversations, it had once been her sanctuary, a place where she'd spent countless hours tending to the roses, the vegetable patch, and the large oak tree that provided shade on warm days. But now, the garden had become a reminder of all she had lost. "The garden looks like it used to be something special," James said softly as he set down her lunch one afternoon. He kept his tone casual, not wanting to push her too hard. "It seems like it could use a little love again." Rebecca's eyes flicked toward the window for just a moment, her expression unreadable. For a long while, she said nothing. James didn't mind the silence. He was used to it by now, but he couldn't help noticing the tension in her hands. the way they clenched and unclenched in her lap as if grappling with something unspoken. "It was beautiful once," she said quietly, her voice so soft that James had to strain to hear it. "I used to spend every afternoon out there." He looked up, surprised by her response. He hadn't expected her to engage, at least not so easily. "I can imagine," James said, smiling gently. "The way you talk about it, I can almost see how it must have looked." Rebecca's face softened for a moment, a flicker of something resembling fondness passing across her features before she turned away again. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said, her voice growing sharper. "I can't tend to it, so there's no point." James paused, his heart aching for her. It was clear that the garden had meant more to her than just a hobby. It had been a part of her, a living extension of her world. And now, with her paralysis, that connection had been severed, leaving her feeling adrift and powerless. "I could help you," James offered gently. "We could work on it together. It might not be the same as before, but I bet we could make it beautiful again." Rebecca's hands clenched again, and for a moment, James thought she might shut him down, just like she had the first day they met. But then, something in her posture shifted. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and her gaze softened as she stared out at the overgrown garden. "What's the point?" she muttered, her voice trembling. "It's better to just let it go." James crouched down beside her wheelchair, his eyes level with hers. "I don't think you really want to let it go," he said softly. "I think it still matters to you. And if it matters to you, it matters to me." Rebecca's jaw tightened, and she looked away again. But James didn't miss the moisture gathering at the corners of her eyes. He remained quiet, allowing her the space to process her emotions without pressure. After all, this wasn't about fixing her or her garden. It was about helping her rediscover the parts of herself that she had buried deep beneath her grief and anger. "I'll think about it," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, not pushing the matter further. It was enough for now. He knew that change, real change, came slowly, and he was willing to wait as long as it took for Rebecca to open that door on her own terms. The next few days passed in much the same way. James continued his routine, but now there was a subtle shift in the air between them. Rebecca seemed less resistant, though she still kept her walls firmly in place. She spoke a little more often, usually about the plants on the windowsill or the meals James prepared. And though her words were few, they carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. One morning, as James was dusting the bookshelves in the living room, he noticed a change in the light. The sun, which had been hidden behind thick clouds for days, suddenly broke through, casting a golden glow across the room. It was the kind of light that made everything seem softer, gentler, as if the world itself was offering a small moment of grace. Rebecca, seated by the window as usual, seemed to notice it too. She looked up, her eyes briefly closing as she tilted her face toward the sunlight, as if drinking in its warmth. James hesitated, unsure if he should disturb her. But then she spoke, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "I miss the roses," she said, her eyes still closed. "They used to bloom every spring, the most beautiful pink you've ever seen." James smiled, his heart swelling with hope. "Maybe we could plant some new ones," he suggested, keeping his tone light. "I'd love to see them bloom again." Rebecca opened her eyes, turning to look at him. For the first time, there was no trace of the cold, hard expression she so often wore. Instead, she looked almost wistful. "I don't know if I can," she said quietly. "I'm not the same person I was before." James stepped closer, crouching down so that he was eye level with her. "I know," he said gently, "but maybe that's okay. Maybe you don't have to be the same person. Maybe it's about finding new ways to keep those parts of you alive." Rebecca didn't respond right away. She simply stared at him, her gaze searching his as if trying to understand the depth of his words. Then, slowly, she nodded. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As the afternoon sun bathed them in its warm light, James felt a small, yet significant shift. It was as if the overgrown garden outside wasn't the only thing beginning to come back to life. Inside, something was stirring, something fragile and new. but undeniably full of hope. They didn't speak much after that, but the silence between them felt different now. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of strangers. Instead, it was the kind of silence that spoke of understanding, of unspoken promises, and of the slow, steady growth of trust. And in that silence, James knew they were planting the seeds of something much bigger than a garden. The following week, something shifted between James and Rebecca. It wasn't a dramatic change, no sudden emotional breakthrough or tearful confession, but rather the slow, steady kind of change that comes when two people, previously locked in their own worlds, begin to reach toward each other. Rebecca was still distant in many ways, but now she spoke more, not just in brief, curt phrases, but in full sentences, sometimes even stories. She still kept her guard up, but there were moments, fleeting, delicate moments, when she let it drop just enough to reveal the person she had once been. And James, with his quiet patience, knew how to read those moments and offer her a space where she didn't have to pretend anymore. One day, as James was clearing away the breakfast dishes, Rebecca broke the silence. "Tell me about your family," she said, her voice soft but clear. James paused, caught off guard by the question. Rebecca had rarely asked him anything personal before. He set the dishes down and turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "Well," he began, leaning against the kitchen counter, "I grew up in a small town, not too different from here. My mom raised me and my sister on her own. Dad wasn't really in the picture." Rebecca's eyes flickered with something, curiosity. Perhaps, but she didn't interrupt. Instead, she listened, her gaze steady. "My sister's younger than me, by about 6 years." James continued. "When we were kids, I used to take care of her a lot, especially when Mom was working. I guess that's where I first learned how to take care of people." Rebecca's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. "You're good at it," she said, her voice low but sincere. James smiled, surprised by the compliment. "Thanks," he said. "I've always found it rewarding. Helping people. I mean, it's not always easy, but it feels like the right thing to do. You know?" Rebecca nodded slowly, her eyes dropping to her lap as if contemplating something. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. After a while, Rebecca broke the silence again, this time more hesitantly. "Do you still talk to your sister?" James's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet sadness. "Not as much as I'd like," he admitted. "She moved away a few years ago, lives out on the West Coast now. We used to be really close. But, you know, life happens. People drift apart." Rebecca's brow furrowed, and she glanced up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "That doesn't seem right," she said, her tone unexpectedly sharp. "If you care about someone, you don't just let them drift away." James was taken aback by the force of her words. But before he could respond, Rebecca sighed and turned her wheelchair toward the window, her fingers idly tracing the armrest. "I'm sorry," she muttered. "I didn't mean to. I shouldn't have said that." James shook his head, moving to stand beside her. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're right, though. I should reach out to her more." Rebecca didn't respond, but James noticed the way her shoulders relaxed slightly, as if some of the tension had left her body. They stood there in companionable silence for a few moments, both of them staring out at the neglected garden. After what felt like an eternity, Rebecca spoke again, her voice softer this time. "I had a sister, too," she said, her words almost a whisper. "Sarah." James turned to look at her, his expression encouraging but silent, not wanting to interrupt the fragile moment of vulnerability. "She was my best friend growing up," Rebecca continued, her gaze distant, as if recalling memories from a lifetime ago. "We did everything together. But after the accident, she couldn't handle it, watching me like this. I guess she stopped visiting, stopped calling." James's heart ached for her. He could hear the pain in her voice, the lingering hurt that came from being abandoned by someone you love. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "That must have been really hard." Rebecca's jaw tightened, and for a moment, James thought she might shut down again. But then, she surprised him. "It was," she admitted. "Still is. Sometimes." I keep wondering what I did wrong. Why she couldn't just be there. James crouched down beside her, his eyes level with hers. You didn't do anything wrong, he said gently. People react to things in different ways, especially when it comes to seeing someone they love in pain. It doesn't make it right, but it's not your fault. Rebecca's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she blinked them away, her expression hardening once more. It doesn't matter now, she muttered. She's gone, and I'm here. James stayed quiet for a moment, allowing her the space to process her emotions. He could see that there was so much more she wanted to say, but she wasn't ready yet. He didn't push her. Instead, he changed the subject, offering her a small, gentle distraction. I noticed the rose bushes look like they're trying to come back, he said, gesturing toward the window. Maybe we could start there, cleaning them up a bit. What do you think? Rebecca glanced out at the garden, her expression guarded but thoughtful. She didn't respond right away, but James could see the wheels turning in her mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded, almost imperceptibly. Maybe, she said, her voice quiet. James smiled, his heart swelling with hope. It wasn't a full commitment, but it was something. It was a start. Over the next few days, James continued his daily routine, but now there was a sense of anticipation in the air. He could feel Rebecca slowly warming to the idea of reclaiming her garden, even if she wasn't quite ready to admit it yet. One morning, as James was preparing breakfast, he heard Rebecca's voice from the living room. I've been thinking, she said, her tone hesitant but clear. James paused, turning to face her. About what? He asked gently. Rebecca's eyes flicked toward the window. Maybe we could start with the roses, just to see if they're salvageable. James grinned, trying not to let his excitement show too much. I'd love that, he said. We'll take it one step at a time. No pressure. Rebecca nodded, her expression softening ever so slightly. One step at a time, she repeated, as if testing out the words. And so, with quiet determination, they began to make plans. They would start with the roses, and if that went well, maybe they'd move on to the rest of the garden. There was still a long road ahead, both for Rebecca's recovery and for the garden's revival. But for the first time in a long time, they were moving forward together. As they prepared for the days to come, James couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet optimism. Rebecca wasn't just reclaiming her garden. She was reclaiming a part of herself that had been lost in the wake of her accident. And in doing so, she was slowly letting him in, piece by piece, allowing him to help her rebuild the life she thought she had lost. It wasn't an easy process, and there were still plenty of challenges ahead. But in that moment, as they stood side by side, planning their next steps, James knew one thing for certain. Together, they could face whatever came their way. As the early autumn sun filtered through the windows, casting soft, golden light across the room, James and Rebecca stood at the edge of the garden. The once vibrant space, now overgrown with weeds and choked by neglect, stretched before them like a symbol of the struggle they both faced. Rebecca's fight to reclaim her independence and James's steady commitment to supporting her. No matter how difficult the journey, Rebecca's wheelchair was positioned near the old rose bushes, their gnarled stems reaching toward the sky as if desperately seeking attention. Despite the weeds and overgrowth, James could see the potential beneath. The garden was still there, just waiting for a little care to bring it back to life. Just like Rebecca. Are you sure you're ready for this? James asked, glancing over at her. His voice was gentle, encouraging, but full of concern. Rebecca sat in silence for a moment, her gaze fixed on the tangled bushes. She didn't speak right away, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. It had taken her weeks to get to this point, to even agree to sit outside, much less begin the task of restoring the garden. Now, as she stared at the roses, a mix of hope and fear seemed to flicker in her eyes. I don't know, she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not sure if I can, if it's worth it. James crouched beside her, his hands resting on the wooden handle of a small garden spade. He had learned not to rush her, not to push when she wasn't ready. Patience, after all, was part of the job. More than that, it was part of how he wanted to be supportive, present, and understanding of her pace. I think it is, he said softly, glancing up at the roses. But it's okay if you're not sure yet. We can take it slow. You don't have to do it all today. Rebecca's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, James saw the flash of frustration in her eyes. The frustration of being trapped in a body that no longer responded the way she wanted it to. The frustration of watching time slip away without being able to take control of it. But then she closed her eyes and let out a deep breath, as if willing herself to release the tension. I used to spend hours out here, she said, her voice softer now, almost wistful. It was my favorite place. I'll come out early in the morning, before the world woke up, and just lose myself in the garden. It was peaceful. I didn't think about anything else, just the plants, the flowers, the way the earth felt under my hands. James listened intently, sensing that she was opening up in a way she hadn't before. He didn't interrupt, knowing that sometimes the hardest part was just allowing the words to come. I haven't been out here in over 2 years, Rebecca continued, her gaze still fixed on the bushes. Not since the accident. It feels like it's not really mine anymore. Like I don't belong here. James's heart ached for her. He could hear the pain in her words, the sense of loss that went beyond just the physical. She wasn't just mourning her mobility. She was mourning a part of herself. A part that had been taken away when her life changed in an instant. You do belong here, James said quietly. This garden is still yours, Rebecca, and it's waiting for you. Rebecca turned to look at him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of doubt and something else, something fragile and elusive, but undeniably there. Hope. How do you always know the right thing to say? She asked, a small, sad smile playing at the corners of her lips. James shrugged, his own smile gentle. I don't, really. I just say what I believe. Rebecca looked away again, her gaze sweeping across the garden. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sound of birds chirping in the distance filled the silence, along with the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, just like Rebecca had described, and for the first time in a long time, it seemed like she was allowing herself to feel that peace, even if only for a moment. Maybe you're right, she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. Maybe it is worth it, but I don't know where to start. James stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands as he surveyed the garden. We start small, he said, one step at a time. We'll work on the roses first, clear out some of the weeds, see if we can get them to bloom again. Rebecca nodded, a flicker of determination crossing her face. Okay, she said, her voice stronger now. Let's do it. James handed her a small pair of pruning shears and wheeled her closer to the rose bushes. He showed her where to start, gently guiding her hands as she made the first cut. The thorns scratched at her gloves, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she focused intently on the task at hand, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was slow work, but as the minutes passed, Rebecca's movements became more confident. She trimmed away the dead branches, cutting through the tangle of weeds that had taken over. James worked alongside her, pulling out the roots and clearing a path for the roses to breathe again. With each snip of the shears, it was as if Rebecca was reclaiming a part of herself. She wasn't just tending to the garden, she was tending to her own healing, her own sense of belonging. The process wasn't easy, and there were moments when she had to pause, her hands trembling with fatigue or frustration. But James was there, always nearby, offering a quiet word of encouragement or simply standing beside her in silent support. After a couple of hours, they had cleared a small patch of the garden. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The roses, though still tangled and weathered, looked a little more like themselves, like they were waiting to bloom again. Rebecca sat back in her wheelchair, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. She looked at the garden, then at James, a hint of a smile on her face. We did it, she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. James grinned, nodding. Yeah, we did. It wasn't just about the garden, it was about what the garden represented. For Rebecca, it was a step toward reclaiming her life, her independence. For James, it was a reminder that even in the face of loss, there was always a way forward, always a way to rebuild. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the garden. James and Rebecca sat together in the peaceful silence, their hands caked in dirt, but their hearts full of hope. It was only the beginning, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were moving towards something beautiful. The days that followed marked a turning point in Rebecca's recovery. It wasn't that the physical obstacles had suddenly disappeared. She still had to confront the daily challenges of living in a body that didn't cooperate the way it once had. But her mindset had shifted. There was a sense of purpose now, a quiet determination that had taken root, much like the revitalized roses in the garden. James continued to visit every day, their routines evolving from simple caregiving to something more profound. He no longer just cooked meals, cleaned the house, and assisted with her mobility needs. Now, they worked side by side, bringing the garden back to life, one small section at a time. It became their shared project, a labor of love that mirrored Rebecca's own journey of healing. One sunny afternoon, James arrived to find Rebecca already outside, positioned near the rose bushes with a trowel in hand. She glanced up at him as he approached, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "Look who's starting without me," James said, his tone light but full of admiration. Rebecca shrugged, feigning nonchalance, but there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I figured I'd get a head start," she replied, her voice steady. "There's a lot of work to be done." James knelt beside her, picking up his own tools. "That there is, but you seem to be managing just fine." As they worked in companionable silence, the sound of birdsong and the rustling of leaves filled the air. The garden was slowly transforming, the dead branches and weeds giving way to fresh soil and budding flowers. It was hard work, but there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing the progress they had made together. At one point, Rebecca paused, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. She looked over at James, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever feel like you're getting a second chance?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with curiosity. James set down his trowel and turned to face her, his brow furrowed slightly in thought. "What do you mean?" Rebecca hesitated for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. "I mean this," she gestured to the garden. Then, to herself, "My life before the accident, it feels like a lifetime ago. And now, with the garden and everything else, it feels like I'm starting over, like I've been given a chance to rebuild." James considered her words, nodding slowly. "I think you're right," he said after a moment. "But I also think it's more than just a second chance. It's about finding something new, something you didn't even know you needed." Rebecca tilted her head, intrigued by his response. "What do you mean?" "Well," James began, leaning back on his heels, "you could look at what happened and see it as a loss. And in some ways, it is. But you're not the same person you were before the accident. You've changed, and that change isn't all bad. It's made you stronger, more resilient. It's given you a new perspective on life, on what really matters." Rebecca absorbed his words in silence, her gaze drifting toward the blooming roses. "I don't feel stronger," she admitted softly. "Most days, I still feel broken." James reached out and gently placed a hand on her arm. "I don't think strength is about never feeling broken," he said. "It's about picking up the pieces and finding a way to move forward, even when it's hard." Rebecca turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. "You always know the right thing to say." James chuckled softly. "I just say what I feel." They continued working in silence for a while longer, the rhythm of their movements calming and steadying. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden, Rebecca found herself reflecting on James's words. She had been so focused on what she had lost, her mobility, her independence, her old life, that she hadn't fully considered what she had gained in the process. She glanced over at James, watching him as he carefully cleared away the last of the weeds. He was more than just her caregiver. He was her friend, her confidant, her partner in this journey. And in a way, he had been her lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of despair when she had felt most lost. She hadn't been able to see it before. But now, as she looked at the garden they had brought back to life together, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she was capable of healing too. Later that evening, as they sat on the back porch, sipping iced tea and watching the sky turn a brilliant shade of orange and pink, Rebecca turned to James with a quiet question that had been on her mind for days. "Do you ever think about what you want for yourself?" she asked, her voice gentle but curious. James raised an eyebrow, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" Rebecca shifted in her wheelchair, her hands resting in her lap. "You've been helping me for so long, and I'm so grateful for everything you've done. But I've never really asked about you. What do you want? What are your dreams?" James looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing his answer carefully. "I guess I haven't really thought about it," he admitted, his voice thoughtful. "I've always focused on helping others, my family, people like you. It's what I've always done." Rebecca nodded, understanding. "But what about you?" she pressed gently. "There must be something you want for yourself, something you dream about." James leaned back in his chair, gazing out at the garden. For a moment, he was silent, lost in thought. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "I think I'd like to open my own care facility someday," he said. "A place where people can come for support, for healing. A place where they're treated with dignity and respect, no matter what they've been through." Rebecca smiled, her heart warming at the thought. "That sounds amazing," she said softly. "I think you'd be incredible at that." James glanced at her, a small, grateful smile on his face. "Thanks. It's just a dream for now. But who knows? Maybe one day." Rebecca reached out and placed her hand on his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I believe in you," she said simply. They sat together in the fading light, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing day. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, they both felt a sense of peace settle over them, a peace that came from knowing that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The garden, once a symbol of loss, was now a testament to their shared strength and hope. And as Rebecca looked out at the roses, their delicate petals glowing in the moonlight, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to bloom too. The days continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and victories for both Rebecca and James. Their routines had become familiar, almost comforting in their predictability. But beneath the surface, both of them were preparing for the next chapter of their lives, a chapter that neither had fully envisioned until now. For Rebecca, her physical progress had reached a point where the impossible was beginning to seem attainable. She had started to stand for longer periods, sometimes even managing a few steps without assistance. It was exhausting and often frustrating, but each step felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that she thought had been lost forever. It was a slow process, but she was determined. James, meanwhile, had been quietly working on his own plans. The more he helped Rebecca, the more he realized how much he wanted to pursue his dream of opening a care facility. His vision was clear, a place where people could find the kind of compassionate support that Rebecca had needed. A place where patients weren't just treated, but nurtured. One warm evening, after a particularly successful therapy session, Rebecca and James sat together in the garden, enjoying the soft glow of the setting sun. The air was warm, and the scent of roses hung sweetly in the air, reminding them both of how far they had come since their first hesitant interactions. "You know," Rebecca began, her voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking a lot about the future lately." James looked over at her, his curiosity piqued. "What about it?" Rebecca paused for a moment, her eyes drifting to the vibrant blooms around them. "I want to do something that matters, something that gives back. I've been given so much, especially by you, and I feel like it's time I find a way to use what I've learned to help others." James's eyes softened, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I've been thinking the same thing," he admitted. Rebecca turned to him, surprise lighting her face. "Really?" James nodded, his expression growing more serious. "Helping you has made me realize that this is what I'm meant to do. I've always wanted to open a care facility, a place where people can find the kind of support they need to rebuild their lives, like you have. But I've never had the courage to take that first step." Rebecca's heart swelled with admiration for him. She had known that James was a kind and dedicated caregiver, But hearing him speak about his own dreams so openly made her realize just how deeply he cared, not just for her, but for the work he did. "You would be amazing at that," Rebecca said, her voice filled with sincerity. "You have a gift. James, you've helped me more than I can put into words." James smiled, though there was a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "I've been thinking about it for a while now. I even started looking into what it would take to get something like that off the ground. It's a lot of work, and honestly, it's a little overwhelming." Rebecca reached out and placed her hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "You don't have to do it alone," she said quietly. "I could help." James looked at her, a mixture of surprise and gratitude in his expression. "You want to be a part of something like that?" Rebecca nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "Absolutely. I've been through this. I know what it feels like to lose hope and to find it again. If I can help others the way you've helped me, I want to do that." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, and James felt a surge of emotion wash over him. It was one thing to have a dream, but to have someone else believe in it, to want to be a part of it, that was something different entirely. He had always known that Rebecca was strong, but seeing her talk about giving back, about using her own experiences to help others, made him realize just how far she had come. "I think we could do it," James said after a moment, his voice steady. "It won't be easy, but I believe we could build something special." Rebecca smiled, a sense of excitement bubbling up inside her. "Then let's start planning." For the next few weeks, their conversations often centered around this shared dream. They talked about the kind of facility they wanted to create, a place that would offer not just physical care, but emotional and psychological support as well. They imagined a team of caregivers who would be as dedicated and compassionate as James. People who would treat each patient as a whole person, not just as a set of medical needs. "We should offer art therapy," Rebecca suggested one evening as they sat in the garden. "It's been such a healing outlet for me. I think it could help others too." James nodded, making a mental note. "I love that idea. And maybe we could have a garden, too, somewhere peaceful, where patients can spend time outside, reconnecting with nature." Rebecca's face lit up at the thought. "Yes, that's perfect. A place where people can feel like they're part of something living, something growing." Their plans began to take shape, and with each new idea, their excitement grew. It was more than just a dream now. It was a real, tangible goal, and the more they talked about it, the more it became clear that this was something they were both deeply passionate about. One evening, as they sat together after another day of planning, Rebecca turned to James with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about how different things would have been if we hadn't met?" James looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I don't dwell on it. I think we were meant to meet, meant to go through all of this together." Rebecca smiled, her heart full. "I think so too. I can't imagine my life without you now." James reached out and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Rebecca nodded, her eyes misting over slightly. "We really have." As they sat there, watching the last rays of sunlight fade into the horizon, they knew that their journey was far from over. But now, they were no longer just surviving, they were building something new, something filled with hope and possibility. And they would face whatever came next together. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity and planning. Rebecca and James poured their energy into the vision of their care facility. Every detail, from the layout of the rooms to the types of programs they would offer, was discussed with enthusiasm and purpose. The idea of helping others, of giving back in a meaningful way, had ignited something deep within both of them, a new sense of purpose. One morning, as Rebecca sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by notes and sketches of the facility they envisioned, she couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. It was only months ago that she had felt trapped in her own body, defeated by the weight of her injury and the isolation it had caused. And now, here she was, not only walking again, but planning a future filled with hope and possibility. James entered the room with 2 cups of coffee, his face bright with a smile. "I've been thinking about the garden," he said, placing a cup in front of Rebecca. "We should make it a central part of the facility. like a sanctuary for people to come and find peace. Rebecca smiled as she took a sip of the warm coffee, her heart swelling with affection for him. "I love that idea," she said. "It could be a place where patients can reconnect with themselves, where they can find comfort in nature, just like it was for me." James sat down beside her, glancing over the sketches spread out on the table. "It'll take a lot of work to make this a reality," he said, his tone thoughtful. "We'll need to find funding, hire staff, and get the right permits. But I know we can do it." Rebecca nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. "We've already overcome so much," she replied. "This is just another challenge, and I'm ready for it." They spent the rest of the morning discussing their next steps. James had already started reaching out to some local organizations, hoping to secure donations and partnerships that could help bring their dream to life. Meanwhile, Rebecca had been researching grants and government programs that could provide the financial support they needed to get started. But as the days went on, they both began to realize just how monumental the task ahead of them truly was. Finding the right support, the funding, and the team they needed would take time, patience, and perseverance. One afternoon, after another long day of planning, Rebecca found herself feeling a bit overwhelmed by it all. She sat in the garden, her sketch pad resting on her lap, as she stared out at the blooming flowers that she and James had worked so hard to nurture. The garden had become a symbol of their journey together, a place that had once been neglected and overgrown, but had now blossomed into something beautiful. It reminded her of the progress she had made in her own life, of the strength she had found through her friendship with James. But still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Could they really make this dream a reality? Was it too ambitious? What if they failed? As if sensing her unease, James appeared in the doorway, watching her with a gentle expression. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, stepping into the garden and taking a seat beside her. Rebecca sighed, closing her sketch pad and setting it aside. "I'm just thinking," she said softly, "about everything. It feels like there's so much to do, and sometimes I wonder if we're in over our heads." James nodded, understanding the weight of her concerns. "It's a big project," he admitted, "but we've faced big challenges before, haven't we?" Rebecca smiled, though it was tinged with uncertainty. "This feels different, though," she said. "This is something we're building from the ground up. It's not just about us anymore. It's about helping other people. What if we can't pull it off?" James reached out and took her hand, his grip reassuring. "We can do this, Rebecca," he said firmly. "I believe in us, and we're not doing it alone. There are people out there who believe in this vision, just like we do. We'll find the support we need. It might take time, but we'll get there." Rebecca looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude for his unwavering faith in their dream. "I don't know what I'd do without you, James," she said quietly. James smiled, his eyes warm with affection. "You don't have to worry about that," he replied. "I'm not going anywhere." In that moment, Rebecca felt a surge of hope. She realized that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, just as they always had. And that gave her the strength to keep going, even when the path seemed uncertain. Over the next few weeks, their efforts began to pay off. James secured meetings with potential donors, while Rebecca continued to research grants and submit applications. They reached out to local businesses, hoping to form partnerships that could help them get the supplies and resources they needed to build the facility. Slowly but surely, things started to fall into place. They received their first donation, a generous contribution from a local charity that believed in their mission. It was a small step, but it felt like a victory. With each new piece of support that came in, their confidence grew. They started meeting with architects to discuss designs for the building, envisioning a space that was open, welcoming, and filled with natural light. Rebecca was especially excited about the art therapy room they had planned, a space where patients could express themselves creatively and find healing through art. But the biggest victory came one sunny afternoon, when James received a phone call from a government representative. They had been approved for a grant that would cover a significant portion of the initial construction costs. When James shared the news with Rebecca, she was speechless. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized that their dream was finally becoming a reality. "We're really doing this," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. James smiled, pulling her into a tight embrace. Yes, we are. In that moment, they both knew that they were on the cusp of something extraordinary. The journey ahead would still be challenging, but they had come so far already, and with each new step, they were building something that would leave a lasting impact on the lives of others. As they stood in the garden that had become a symbol of their growth, Rebecca and James felt a deep sense of peace. They had nurtured this dream together, just as they had nurtured the flowers around them. And now, it was time for their dream to bloom. The months following the approval of their grant were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and preparations. Every day seemed to bring new challenges. Yet with each step, Rebecca and James grew closer to realizing their shared dream. Their excitement was palpable, but with it came a sense of responsibility that weighed heavily on both of them. Rebecca often found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. There had been a time when she felt broken and alone, lost in her grief and unable to see a future beyond her limitations. Now, with James by her side, not only had she found the strength to heal, but they had both found a purpose that extended beyond themselves. One late evening, as they sat together in the living room after a long day, Rebecca looked at James, who was studying architectural plans spread across the coffee table. The soft glow of the lamp illuminated his face, revealing the exhaustion in his eyes, but also the unwavering determination that she had come to admire so deeply. James, she began quietly, her voice breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. He looked up from the plans, his tired eyes meeting hers. Yeah, Rebecca hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to express the thoughts that had been swirling in her mind. She had been thinking a lot about the people they would soon be helping, the individuals who would come through the doors of their care facility, seeking not just physical healing, but emotional support, just as she had. I've been thinking, she said slowly, about the people who will come to us for help. Some of them will be just like me. You know, they'll be scared and angry, maybe even unwilling to accept the help they need. And I just hope we can be what they need us to be. James listened intently, his expression softening as he absorbed her words. We will be, he said firmly. You've been through this. Rebecca, you know what it's like to feel lost and to find your way back. You'll be able to reach them in a way no one else can. Rebecca smiled, though her eyes were still clouded with uncertainty. I hope so. But what if I'm not strong enough? What if I can't help them the way you helped me? James set the plans aside and leaned forward, taking her hands in his. You don't have to be perfect, he said gently. You just have to be yourself. That's what people will respond to, your kindness, your empathy. You've already shown so much strength just by getting to this point. And when you show up for them the way you showed up for yourself, that's what will make the difference. Rebecca's heart swelled at his words, but there was still a flicker of doubt that lingered within her. What if I don't have the answers they need? What if I can't help them heal? James smiled softly, his hands warm around hers. Sometimes it's not about having the answers. Sometimes it's just about being there, about listening, offering a shoulder to lean on. That's what you did for me, and that's what we'll do for them. We'll be there for them in whatever way they need. And that's enough. Rebecca exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of her worries lift, if only slightly. James had a way of calming her fears, of reminding her that she didn't have to carry the world on her shoulders alone. And in that moment, she knew that together, they could face whatever came their way. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca and James threw themselves into the final stages of planning. They worked tirelessly with the architects and contractors, watching as the facility began to take shape. Walls went up, rooms were painted, and the garden was carefully designed to be a central, peaceful place for patients to find solace. It was a labor of love, and with each passing day, the dream became more tangible. But as the opening date drew closer, the pressure began to mount. There were moments when Rebecca felt overwhelmed by the enormity of what they were about to undertake. Would they be able to meet the expectations they had set for themselves? Would they be able to provide the kind of care and support they had envisioned? One evening, After a particularly stressful meeting with the construction team, Rebecca found herself sitting alone in the garden, staring up at the stars. The cool night air wrapped around her, soothing the tension that had built up in her body. She closed her eyes, taking slow, deep breaths, and tried to quiet the doubts that had crept back into her mind. A few minutes later, she heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. Opening her eyes, she saw James walking toward her, a concerned expression on his face. "Hey," he said softly, sitting down beside her on the bench. "You okay?" Rebecca nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. "Just needed a moment to breathe," she admitted. James reached over and took her hand, his thumb gently brushing over her knuckles. "I get it," he said. "It's a lot, but we're almost there." "I know," Rebecca replied, her voice barely above a whisper. It's hard not to feel like everything's riding on this. Like if we fail, we'll be letting everyone down." James squeezed her hand, his voice steady and reassuring. "We're not going to fail. Look at everything we've accomplished already. We've come so far, and we're doing this for the right reasons. That's what matters." Rebecca smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude for his support. "I don't know what I'd do without you, James." He smiled back, his eyes warm with affection. "You do just fine," he said teasingly. "But I'm glad we're doing this together." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars twinkle in the night sky. The weight of their responsibilities still lingered, but it didn't feel quite as heavy anymore. Together, they had built something beautiful, a space where people could find healing, just as they had found healing in each other. As the night wore on, they talked quietly about the future, about their hopes and dreams for the facility, and for themselves. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day, and it was clear to both of them that their partnership extended far beyond the walls of the care facility they were building. Eventually, they rose from the bench, walking back toward the house hand in hand, their hearts lighter than they had been in days. The next morning, they were back at the facility, overseeing the final touches. The opening was just weeks away, and there was still much to be done, but the excitement in the air was palpable. The dream they had nurtured for so long was finally becoming a reality. And as they stood in the garden, watching the sunrise paint the sky with hues of pink and gold, Rebecca realized that this was just the beginning. The care facility wasn't just a place where people would come to heal. It was a place where lives would be changed, where hope would be restored, and where love and empathy would flourish. Together, she and James had built something extraordinary, and together, they would continue to nurture it, just as they had nurtured the garden that now bloomed with life around them. The day they had worked so hard for finally arrived. Rebecca stood in the doorway of the newly completed care facility, her heart pounding with a mix of pride, excitement, and nervousness. The sun was rising slowly, casting a soft golden light across the pristine garden, and illuminating the building that stood as a testament to all the hard work, sacrifice, and love that had gone into making this dream a reality. James was by her side, his expression mirroring her emotions. He, too, had poured his heart into this project. And now, as the ribbon-cutting ceremony loomed just hours away, the magnitude of what they were about to achieve settled deeply within both of them. "Can you believe it?" James asked quietly, his voice filled with wonder as he gazed at the facility. "We actually did it." Rebecca smiled, her eyes misting with tears. "It's hard to believe. There were so many moments when I thought we wouldn't make it. But we did," James replied, his tone resolute. "And not just for us, for all the people who will come here looking for hope, for healing." Rebecca nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle in her chest. "I just hope we can live up to what they need." James turned to her, his eyes filled with quiet confidence. "We will. Look at everything you've overcome. Rebecca, you've been on this journey yourself, and now you're in a position to guide others through theirs. That's something no one else can offer." His words comforted her, as they always did, but the nerves still buzzed under her skin. This was more than just a care facility to her. It was a symbol of her own healing, of the life she had reclaimed after her accident. And now, it was a place where others could find the same strength she had discovered. As the hours passed, the final preparations for the opening were made. Staff members, handpicked by Rebecca and James, moved through the halls, readying themselves for the day's events. Flowers were arranged in the common areas, the scent of fresh roses and daisies filling the air. The garden, meticulously designed and tended to, stood as a peaceful oasis for all who would soon walk through its paths. By late morning, guests began arriving, donors, supporters, friends, and community members, all eager to witness the official launch of the care facility. Among them were individuals who had been following Rebecca and James's journey, inspired by their story and the passion behind their work. Rebecca's heart raced as she and James prepared to greet the crowd gathered outside. She had never been one for public speaking, but today, she would have to stand in front of everyone and share her story, her vision for the facility, and her hopes for the future. It was a daunting task, but one she knew she couldn't avoid. James, sensing her anxiety, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this," he said softly. "Just speak from the heart. That's what people will connect with." Rebecca took a deep breath, nodding as she steadied herself. Together, they stepped out onto the platform that had been set up in front of the facility, greeted by applause and cheers from the gathered crowd. The sight of so many people, supporters and future patients alike, filled her with a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something bigger. As the applause died down, Rebecca stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she took the microphone. She glanced at James, who gave her an encouraging nod, and then she turned to face the audience, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice carrying across the crowd. "This facility represents so much more than just a place for care. For me, it represents hope, a hope that was once lost, but has since been found." She paused, her eyes scanning the faces before her, many of whom were nodding in understanding. "There was a time in my life when I didn't think I could move forward. I didn't believe I had the strength to heal, to find joy again. But with the help of those around me, I learned that healing isn't something you do alone. It takes community, it takes love, and it takes patience." Rebecca's voice grew stronger as she continued. "That's what this facility is about. It's a place where people can come not just to heal physically, but emotionally. It's a place where they'll find support, understanding, and the tools they need to rebuild their lives." She looked over at James, her heart swelling with gratitude. "And I couldn't have done this without my partner, James. His unwavering belief in this vision has been the foundation of everything we've built here." The crowd applauded, and James gave a humble nod, but it was clear from the emotion in his eyes that he, too, was deeply moved by Rebecca's words. "We don't have all the answers," Rebecca continued, her voice softening, "but we do have a lot of love and a lot of faith in what's possible when people come together to support one another. That's what we're offering here, a space where healing is nurtured, where hope is restored, and where no one has to face their challenges alone." Tears welled up in her eyes as she finished, but they were tears of pride and relief. The crowd erupted in applause, the sound a wave of encouragement that washed over her, filling her with a deep sense of accomplishment. As the ribbon was cut and the doors officially opened, Rebecca and James were the first to step inside, leading the way for the guests who followed. The staff greeted everyone with warm smiles, offering tours of the facility and explaining the various programs and services that would be available to patients. Rebecca found herself standing in the garden, watching as people explored the space she had once envisioned as a place of peace and renewal. The sight of it filled her with an indescribable joy. This was exactly what she had hoped for. James joined her, his eyes bright with pride. "Look at this," he said softly, gesturing to the people milling about the garden. "You made this possible." "We made this possible," Rebecca corrected, smiling as she looked up at him. They stood there together, watching as the first patients arrived, individuals who, like Rebecca, were beginning their own journeys toward healing. Some were hesitant, others hopeful, But all of them were greeted with the same warmth and kindness that Rebecca had come to expect from her staff. In the days and weeks that followed, the care facility quickly became a beacon of hope in the community. Word spread about the exceptional care and the unique environment that Rebecca and James had created. And soon, people from all walks of life were seeking out their services. Rebecca found herself growing more confident with each passing day. Her role as both a leader and a caregiver becoming more defined. She worked closely with patients, sharing her own experiences and offering guidance when needed. James, too, became an integral part of the facility. His natural empathy and strength of character earning him the respect and admiration of both staff and patients alike. As they continued their work, Rebecca realized that the care facility had become more than just a place for healing. It had become a home for those who had lost their way, a community where people could find not only support, but friendship and belonging. And for Rebecca and James, it had become the embodiment of their shared vision, a vision of love, empathy, and forgiveness that would continue to inspire and uplift all who walked through its doors. As the sun set on that first day, Rebecca stood at the edge of the garden, looking out at the vibrant flowers that had been carefully planted. She smiled to herself, knowing that this was just the beginning of something truly special. With James by her side, and with the support of her community, she knew that they were building something that would last, a place where people could come to find hope, healing, and, most importantly, love. Thank you all for joining us on this incredible journey of love, healing, and the power of never giving up. Rebecca and James's story reminds us that, even in the darkest times, there is always hope when we have each other. We appreciate your time, and we hope this story touched your heart as much as it touched ours. Don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this. And feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world to us. The day they had worked so hard for finally arrived. Rebecca stood in the doorway of the newly completed care facility, her heart pounding with a mix of pride, excitement, and nervousness. The sun was rising slowly, casting a soft golden light across the pristine garden, and illuminating the building that stood as a testament to all the hard work, sacrifice, and love that had gone into making this dream a reality. James was by her side, his expression mirroring her emotions. He, too, had poured his heart into this project. And now, as the ribbon-cutting ceremony loomed just hours away, the magnitude of what they were about to achieve settled deeply within both of them. Can you believe it? James asked quietly, his voice filled with wonder as he gazed at the facility. We actually did it. Rebecca smiled, her eyes misting with tears. It's hard to believe. There were so many moments when I thought we wouldn't make it. But we did, James replied, his tone resolute. And not just for us, for all the people who will come here looking for hope, for healing. Rebecca nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle in her chest. I just hope we can live up to what they need. James turned to her, his eyes filled with quiet confidence. We will. Look at everything you've overcome. Rebecca, you've been on this journey yourself, and now you're in a position to guide others through theirs. That's something no one else can offer. His words comforted her, as they always did, but the nerves still buzzed under her skin. This was more than just a care facility to her. It was a symbol of her own healing, of the life she had reclaimed after her accident. And now, it was a place where others could find the same strength she had discovered. As the hours passed, the final preparations for the opening were made. Staff members, handpicked by Rebecca and James, moved through the halls, readying themselves for the day's events. Flowers were arranged in the common areas, the scent of fresh roses and daisies filling the air. The garden, meticulously designed and tended to, stood as a peaceful oasis for all who would soon walk through its paths. By late morning, guests began arriving, donors, supporters, friends, and community members, all eager to witness the official launch of the care facility. Among them were individuals who had been following Rebecca and James's journey, inspired by their story and the passion behind their work. Rebecca's heart raced as she and James prepared to greet the crowd gathered outside. She had never been one for public speaking, but today, she would have to stand in front of everyone and share her story, her vision for the facility, and her hopes for the future. It was a daunting task, but one she knew she couldn't avoid. James, sensing her anxiety, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this," he said softly. "Just speak from the heart. That's what people will connect with." Rebecca took a deep breath, nodding as she steadied herself. Together, they stepped out onto the platform that had been set up in front of the facility, greeted by applause and cheers from the gathered crowd. The sight of so many people, supporters and future patients alike, filled her with a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something bigger. As the applause died down, Rebecca stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she took the microphone. She glanced at James, who gave her an encouraging nod, and then she turned to face the audience, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice carrying across the crowd. "This facility represents so much more than just a place for care. For me, it represents hope, a hope that was once lost, but has since been found." She paused, her eyes scanning the faces before her, many of whom were nodding in understanding. "There was a time in my life when I didn't think I could move forward. I didn't believe I had the strength to heal, to find joy again. But with the help of those around me, I learned that healing isn't something you do alone. It takes community, it takes love, and it takes patience." Rebecca's voice grew stronger as she continued. "That's what this facility is about. It's a place where people can come not just to heal physically, but emotionally. It's a place where they'll find support, understanding, and the tools they need to rebuild their lives." She looked over at James, her heart swelling with gratitude. "And I couldn't have done this without my partner, James. His unwavering belief in this vision has been the foundation of everything we've built here." The crowd applauded, and James gave a humble nod, but it was clear from the emotion in his eyes that he, too, was deeply moved by Rebecca's words. "We don't have all the answers," Rebecca continued, her voice softening, "but we do have a lot of love and a lot of faith in what's possible when people come together to support one another. That's what we're offering here, a space where healing is nurtured, where hope is restored, and where no one has to face their challenges alone." Tears welled up in her eyes as she finished, but they were tears of pride and relief. The crowd erupted in applause, the sound a wave of encouragement that washed over her, filling her with a deep sense of accomplishment. As the ribbon was cut and the doors officially opened, Rebecca and James were the first to step inside, leading the way for the guests who followed. The staff greeted everyone with warm smiles, offering tours of the facility and explaining the various programs and services that would be available to patients. Rebecca found herself standing in the garden, watching as people explored the space she had once envisioned as a place of peace and renewal. The sight of it filled her with an indescribable joy. This was exactly what she had hoped for. James joined her, his eyes bright with pride. "Look at this," he said softly, gesturing to the people milling about the garden. "You made this possible." "We made this possible," Rebecca corrected, smiling as she looked up at him. They stood there together, watching as the first patients arrived, individuals who, like Rebecca, were beginning their own journeys toward healing. Some were hesitant, others hopeful, but all of them were greeted with the same warmth and kindness that Rebecca had come to expect from her staff. In the days and weeks that followed, the care facility quickly became a beacon of hope in the community. Word spread about the exceptional care and the unique environment that Rebecca and James had created. And soon, people from all walks of life were seeking out their services. Rebecca found herself growing more confident with each passing day, her role as both a leader and a caregiver becoming more defined. She worked closely with patients, sharing her own experiences and offering guidance when needed. James, too, became an integral part of the facility, his natural empathy and strength of character earning him the respect and admiration of both staff and patients alike. As they continued their work, Rebecca realized that the care facility had become more than just a place for healing. It had become a home for those who had lost their way, a community where people could find not only support, but friendship and belonging. And for Rebecca and James, it had become the embodiment of their shared vision, a vision of love, empathy, and forgiveness that would continue to inspire and uplift all who walked through its doors. As the sun set on that first day, Rebecca stood at the edge of the garden, looking out at the vibrant flowers that had been carefully planted. She smiled to herself, knowing that this was just the beginning of something truly special. With James by her side, and with the support of her community, she knew that they were building something that would last, a place where people could come to find hope, healing, and, most importantly, love. Thank you all for joining us on this incredible journey of love, healing, and the power of never giving up. Rebecca and James's story reminds us that, even in the darkest times, there is always hope when we have each other. We appreciate your time, and we hope this story touched your heart as much as it touched ours. Don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world to us.